How much would it take for you to risk your life? For these hunters, it was $5,000 each. They were told it was a straightforward task: track down and remove a rogue bear in a remote stretch of forest. They'd already accepted half the money up front, a sum large enough to silence the instinct that something about this job was wrong. But when the ground revealed tracks no human or bear should have left, the truth began to surface. What kind of creature had they really agreed to hunt? It began not with a phone call to all four men, but with a single invitation. The narrator was contacted by a go-between, asked to meet a potential client at a dimly lit bar in Odd Place to arrange what was supposed to be a straightforward job. There, the client introduced him to three men already signed on. Their task, the man explained, was to deal with a problem bear on private land. $5,000 each, no paperwork, no questions. To make it even harder to walk away, half the money was offered up front. Along with that came an arsenal, 300 Winchester Magnum bolt-action rifles, plenty of ammunition, enough for a small war. Those details, far from comforting, should have been alarming, but at the time, they were simply part of the deal. The three other men looked capable enough, though none spoke much about why they were there. One was massive, built like he had spent his life proving that obstacles could be moved out of his way by sheer force. Another had the posture of someone who never shed military discipline, his watchful eyes measuring angles and distances, even as he sat. The oldest carried himself differently, quiet, deliberate, a man who had long ago learned how to read tracks in the dirt better than most people read words. Together they made a group that could handle almost anything in the wild, and perhaps because of that, they chose silence over doubt. Even so, the terms of the job gnawed at them. Why was a private landowner handling this without rangers? Why insist on secrecy if the problem really was just a rogue bear? In the truck rumbling toward the forest, questions hung unspoken. The weight of $5,000 pressed them down harder than any clarity did. Each mile tightened the choice they had already made, turning hesitation into something more dangerous: acceptance. The deeper into the forest they drove, the more the land itself seemed reluctant to receive them. The sun faded not only because of the hour, but because the trees hung thick overhead, swallowing light. Birds that should have called out in the late season were few, their songs abrupt, ending as if cut off mid-note. Radios and satellite phones sputtered, voices dissolving into static. The men noted it, but didn't linger, chalking it up to interference. Convincing themselves of that meant they didn't have to face what it actually implied. They were moving into a place that would soon cut them off entirely. At brief stops, their unease surfaced in stillness. The ex-soldier spent longer staring at tree lines than necessary, his hands near his weapon even in moments of rest. The tracker examined ground disturbances, lines pressed into the soil where something large had passed, and found no pattern that made sense. Not quite bear, not quite anything he could identify, but he chose to say little until he was certain. The big man muttered that $5,000 was worth whatever they found, but his tone carried less conviction than his size suggested. No one argued with him, though each listened as if trying to see if he believed it himself. The patterns of doubt stacked quickly. No officials involved, no clear proof that a rogue bear even existed, and a growing sense that the secrecy was not just for the landowner's convenience. Still, the truth remained buried beneath the obvious pull of survival by pay. They all needed the money. That was as simple and as compromising as it got. And so they pushed on, trading quiet stares instead of confessions, each man caught between instinct and obligation. By the time they reached the spot where they were told to establish camp, the forest had already drawn a kind of curtain around them. The base was nothing more than a rough clearing with a fire pit and a few basic supplies. No buildings, no sign of care, no trace that people came here regularly. The silence was thick enough to make conversation sound out of place, so no one talked much anyway. The air carried a cold heaviness that didn't match the season, and the sense of being watched returned again and again without explanation. Their decision to accept the mission had already sealed their path. They did not see it that way yet, not fully, but every missing detail in the client's story weighed a little heavier as the night approached. The land gave them no dramatic warning, only the kind of stillness that suggested warnings had been spent long ago. And then, before the first tent was staked into the ground, their first clue arrived. The first sign was pressed into the damp soil of a streambed, unmistakable in its clarity. A single footprint, far larger than any of theirs, stretched twice the length of the narrator's boot and spread nearly twice as wide. 5 distinct toes marked the front, human-like in shape but massive, with no claw impressions at all. The depth of the indentation alone spoke volumes. It wasn't just size, it was weight, estimated near 500 pounds, heavy enough to sink cleanly into the soft ground and leave no doubt that something immense and upright had passed through. The tracker crouched low and traced the outline with his hand. His silence said more than words could, but he eventually confirmed it. This was no bear. The even balance, the measured pressure, the stride moving forward rather than splaying or lurching, all betrayed a natural, upright walk. The spacing between steps stretched almost double what a man could cover comfortably, but there was no stumble, no awkward lunge, only smooth, confident rhythm. This creature walked on 2 legs, and it did so with unshakable ease. The group searched quickly for rational answers. The largest of them muttered about a hermit, some massive wild man who abandoned civilization. The ex-soldier dismissed it almost immediately. No man on earth left prints like these, not with such depth, not with that kind of stride repeated consistently over rough, uneven ground. A human of such size would falter often, their weight shifting unevenly. Yet these impressions carried absolute control, each line sunk into the mud with the quiet certainty of a body designed for balance. The argument withered as fast as it arose, leaving only the discomfort of logic failing in familiar woods. Around them, the forest quieted. No birds rushed overhead. No small animals stirred the underbrush. The hunters didn't need to talk about it. Each felt the absence press in. Fingers brushed rifle stocks more often. Shoulders tensed, and their boots slowed. A snapped branch in the distance jolted heads around in unison, weapons lifting a fraction higher. They tried to reach out. The satellite phone, their only thread of security, refused to cooperate under the thick canopy. Static buzzed through the speaker. Shortened fragments of syllables broke off and vanished. They adjusted positions, climbed shallow rises to test the signal, but every call dissolved into the same dead air. The conclusion settled in fast. No help would reach them. No one beyond that tree line could be told what had been found. From the moment the phone failed, they were alone with whatever carved those tracks into the streamside mud. Pressing further, the prints guided them deeper. Each reappearance of those massive feet in pliable soil disrupted the thin shields of denial they had built. Sometimes the tracks vanished onto stony patches with deliberate foot placement, then re-emerged precisely on the far side, a trick that demanded careful control. To the trained eyes of the tracker, it was intentional concealment. Not an animal wandering aimlessly, but a being choosing to step quietly, to mask its path, while still leaving marks that could be found by those daring to follow. One of the men muttered that the thing was letting them know it was there, but not inviting them closer. The deeper they walked, the heavier the mood became. Each observation carved hope down smaller. Stride length, weight distribution, toe spread, none of it matched bear or moose or man. It matched nothing familiar at all, and with every new print, the air around them seemed tighter, the trees leaning as if against their backs. Breathing grew louder in that silence, harder to hide. No one put it to words, but the thought eventually unified them. They were tracking something that didn't want to be found, but also didn't mind showing just enough to remind them it was there. Their rifles, once carried with a sense of control, now felt insufficient light shields in a domain that belonged to whatever moved ahead. Each man tightened his grip without admitting what it meant. The trail they followed had already rewritten the job. It was no longer a bear hunt, no longer about earning $5,000. It had become something else entirely, a pursuit shaped by evidence that pointed to intelligence, power, and territory. And as much as the tracks unsettled them, they weren't the only signs waiting in the forest. The land itself was about to reveal markings even more disturbing than footprints pressed into the earth. The first sign loomed above them, raw and undeniable. A young tree about 8 inches thick had been snapped nearly 7 feet off the ground. The wood was still green and wet, its fibers twisted as though an immense hand had wrung it like kindling. Splinters flared outward in spirals, fresh and sharp, leaving no question that the break was recent. The ex-military man pressed a palm against the shredded edge, his trained eye gauging stress and leverage. His verdict was immediate. No storm, no tool, no human strength could snap living wood like that, not at that angle. It was a deliberate act, one that displayed brute force beyond the reach of any man or any bear they had ever known. Not far from that first break, another tree bore stranger scars. Sections of bark from roughly 6 to 10 feet up had been peeled away in wide vertical strips. Beneath, 4 clean grooves scored across exposed wood parallel, deep and spaced at intervals that resembled human fingers more than claws. Bare markings scatter downward in uneven arcs. These were straight, heavy impressions that suggested a hand large enough to grip the trunk outright. Looking up, the men measured the height again and again, each calculation ending at the same unsettled conclusion. Whatever had done this towered over their tallest member. The tracker circled the tree, crouching low where the soil had shifted. The marks were not the neat ovals of single footprints, but a broad disturbance in the earth, as though massive weight had braced against the trunk. It had not scraped for food or sharpened claws. Every detail pointed to intent. They exchanged looks, but said little, unwilling to voice what marks carved so high and precise might really mean. Their unease grew heavier when, deeper in the woods, they reached a small clearing. The ground itself bore evidence of occupation. At its center lay a depression shaped unmistakably like a body stretched at rest, huge in scale. Grass and moss had been torn away from the edges of the clearing and layered into bedding, soft and deliberate. Around it lay the refuse of meals, fruit rinds discarded in arcs, bones split lengthwise as if for marrow, each fracture bearing the sign of controlled force. The soldier stepped quietly through the space, his eyes narrowing on the layout. The clearing offered full sight lines in all directions, yet narrow trails broke away into thick cover. To him, it was clear this site was no accident. The vantage was chosen to balance comfort and defense, with escape routes woven into its edge. Whatever had built the bedding had also evaluated terrain and claimed it with careful judgment. They did not speak openly, but each man understood. These were not random scars or casual signs of animal habit, but a sequence of deliberate displays. Strength in the twisted tree, reach in the gouged bark, intelligence in the bedding. Together they marked the place as living territory, a statement of occupation. The hunters were moving not through wilderness without order, but into a boundary already owned. Silence followed them more closely than before. Even the most brash among them held his tongue, his broad shoulders stiff under the weight of realization. The facts allowed no easy denial. They were not isolating anomalies one at a time anymore. They were standing inside a continuum of evidence, and each detail tightened its grip. No one admitted it, but the thought hung heavy across their group. They had not been chosen to clear this land of a threat. They had been lured into a domain already defended, one where signs of power hung above them like warnings. Then the woods themselves began to change. Subtle at first, the shift in air, the strange hush that replaced even the ordinary chatter of birds. The men felt it almost immediately. Stillness pressed down, not in peace, but in something closer to a warning. And in that silence they realized sound was coming. Something vocal, vast, and impossible to mistake was about to break the quiet. The stillness held. No movement, no sound. Then the vibration started, a low rumble that seemed to stir the ground itself, rolling through the soil and into their ribs. It was not a distant boom of thunder or the reed-thin cry of some night animal. It lived inside their bones, an intrusion more felt than heard. The vibration climbed steadily, stretching into a roar that bent upward into a scream. The escalation lasted long enough for certainty to set in. Nearly 10 seconds of sound that pressed against them until it became all they could hear. One hunter would later recall that it seemed to carve straight into the body, bypassing ears entirely, a noise that dismantled thought before speech could rise. They had spent their lives acquainted with the voices of forests, owls in dark hours, coyotes layered across distant hills, even the harsh bugle of elk echoing valleys. This sound belonged nowhere in that spectrum. It was animal, but not contained within animal bounds. There was weight in its tone, an almost communicative quality that made fear more personal, as if the sound had been directed at them with intent. When it stopped, they did not breathe. The silence was shorter than the noise, but heavier. It pressed tighter than the roar itself, a vacuum of expectation. No man moved in that moment. Two looked at the soldier instinctively, waiting on him, but his rifle hand had slipped slightly, his controls shaken. The tracker's lips parted without words. A pallor stretched across his face. Even the brute's stronger form showed the sag of weightless knees, boots scuffing soil without motion. Seconds passed unmeasured. Then a second wave rose, not from one source, but many. Distant answers carried across timber, first faint, then layered. They came in intervals, responding as if in conversation. One echo from the west bled into another from high ground to the north, then doubled from deeper cover behind them. It was not random. There was pattern. Breaks between tones, re-entries at timed spaces, calls overlapping, then holding back, as though voices were arranged across the land itself. The forest had taken shape not as empty wilderness, but as stage. Each howl filled coordinates the men had already marked as trees, thickets, or hollows. Now those places belonged to something else. Understanding did not arrive in argument. It arrived in breath sinking shorter, eyes darting faster across tree lines. Every man recognized it for what it was. They weren't overhearing animals startling one another. They were hearing presence organized, a sound that surrounded, acknowledging their intrusion and drawing it taut. The ex-soldier flinched at one echo not 20 yards distant that cut off abruptly as though silenced on command. That, more than anything, spelled coordination. Again the silence, sharp, uneasy. From that stillness form emerged. A figure stepped forward from tree line to clearing. Wide shoulders slid into sight first, then a body built by proportions wrong for man, yet aligned to human stance. Arms long enough to suggest immense reach, a chest expanding wider than any frame they had known. Step by step, it closed distance with weight heavy enough to register. Soil trembled minutely under each landing heel. The height left little room for denial. 8.5 to 9 feet borne upright, unapologetic. Worst of all were the eyes. They caught dim light and returned it not as glow, but as recognition. They tracked deliberately, looking into each man, holding contact longer than instinct allows between predator and prey. Not the blank gaze of wild instinct, but something intelligent, measured, aware. Not one of them whispered bear. Not one of them leaned on mistaken hermits or illusions of dusk light. Every trace of denial dissolved under the clarity of that body in open ground. They knew this matched the tracks. They knew the twisted trees spoke its power. They knew they stood now under its claim. Their muscles ached with suspended command. Run, fire, shout, none chose first. Their rifles came higher, but breaths went shallow, shaking. The brute clenched jaw and teeth, the soldier tightened stance. The tracker swallowed throat dry. Choice broke open not by decision, but by eruption. The crack of gunfire split the silence, louder than the screams had been, ending stillness in a single violent act. The ex-military hunter moved first, raising his .300 Winchester Magnum bolt-action rifle and sending a round straight into the creature's chest. The blast kicked against his shoulder, and in the flash of recoil they saw fur burst, dark blood spray, and the great frame stagger. For a moment, it looked like the shot had done its work, but the pause was fleeting. The creature straightened, turned back, and let out a scream that shook the clearing. It charged. The brute opened fire next, his rifle cracking in uneven rhythm. The tracker steadied his own weapon and joined in, precise even through disbelief. The narrator shouldered his rifle and fired 2 more shots into its massive torso. 4 rifles barked in unison, shell casings spinning to the ground, smoke rolling through the air. The coordinated fire filled the forest with sound, each man pouring bullet after bullet toward the advancing giant. The creature never slowed. Step by step it closed ground, its strides enormous, its shoulders swinging, arms slicing through air like pendulums. Each impact of its feet felt like a drumbeat in soil, shaking the ground beneath the men. The .300 Winchester Magnum rounds should have stopped anything that breathed elk, moose, even charging bears, but here they only bought moments. Blood streamed from the beast's chest and arms, yet it drove forward through the barrage, its endurance mocking every assumption these men had carried into the hunt. The soldier fired again, then again, teeth clenched, his body rigid with discipline. Still, the thing pressed forward, roar rising above rifle thunder. This roar was not just sound, but fury, a mix of pain and rage, so loud it split through their gunfire and echoed across the trees. The brute stumbled backward, eyes wide, as though his mind refused what his eyes confirmed. Rounds were striking true, hitting vital target zones, but the creature refused to fall. Their rhythm collapsed into panic. Shots came faster, less coordinated. The tracker's voice cracked mid-yell, urging more fire as he squeezed the trigger again and again. The clearing filled with smoke and echoes, the air trembling from concussion, rifles heated from rapid fire. Still it came. Finally, the marathon of rounds began to take effect. The giant faltered. Its stride lost balance. A chest-rattling breath forced its lungs to heave. Shoulders swung off tempo. Its legs buckled, weight jerking side to side. Then the massive body toppled, crashing so hard into the earth that the ground quivered under the blast of impact. The noise matched the fall of a tree, but it was not over. The creature dragged its arms forward, tearing furrows into the soil. Its torso lifted, head straining to rise. Even collapsed, it reached toward them, blood pouring freely but strength refusing surrender. Its body heaved upward again, muscles still working in defiance. The ex-military hunter did not hesitate. He steadied his rifle, barrel aimed, and fired directly into the skull. The first round snapped into bone. The head rocked back but pushed up once more. He chambered another shot. The second round smashed through, and this time the giant slumped forward. Movement ended. Finally, the soil beneath it was still. The silence that followed was brutal. Smoke hung in the clearing. The bitter sharpness of gunpowder choked in their throats. There was copper on their tongues, sweat burning in their eyes. Their ears rang with the echo of their own rifles, and beneath it all, a musky odor, heavy and primal, rose from the collapsed frame. None of them cheered. None raised a voice. Their hunt was reduced to jagged breath and a void pressing against nerves stripped raw. Then the forest answered them. From the tree line came a call, low, guttural, carrying distance. Another followed, higher in pitch, but near enough to overlap. Then more, layered from different points of the woods. from the slope above, from the shadowed thickets behind, from ground opposite the creek. The voices did not clash. They traded rhythm, one rising as another fell. It was patterned, deliberate, and coordinated. Not a scattering of confused noise, but language. A message moving across trees in alternating notes. The hunters understood without needing the words. The creature at their feet was not alone. Its voice had been part of a larger presence, one that now called out in response to its end. The clearing that seconds earlier belonged to them was reclaimed in sound, an orchestration stretching across the forest, each call a declaration that they had been heard. Every man felt it then. They were not victors. They were intruders who had killed one and awoken many. Instinct screamed not of triumph but of encirclement, and with that knowledge came something more dangerous than the gunfire itself. Not the fight they had just endured, but the realization that survival would no longer depend on their bullets. It would depend on escaping what had already begun to close in around them. The forest gave no chance to recover. Calls spread wider, shifting from random noise into deliberate cadence, each one marking position as if the men were being counted. Shapes did not need to be seen for the threat to tighten. The sound itself revealed coordination. Panic turned them north. Feet hammering against root and rock, rifles clutched useless while treetops carried the signals of pursuit. Behind, the air filled with crashing limbs, but none of the bodies closed for the kill. The chase stretched not in chaos, but direction, as though they were being pushed rather than hunted down. The ex-soldier took the front, training carving clarity into panic. He shouted out obstacles, forcing the others to keep stride through the dark lattice of timber. Branches whipped into their skin, lungs burned as they ran, but the sense grew that their choices had already narrowed. The forest thinned only where stone reared up, a sheer cliff face driving them straight toward the shadow of a cave mouth at its base. They had no pause for thought. Instinct shoved them inside. By the time their breath steadied in the cool chamber, it was too late to realize the retreat was chosen for them. What followed outside stripped away denial. The echoes of pursuit fell silent, replaced by a grinding noise that sent vibration into the cave walls. Stone against stone, slow and deliberate, layered with guttural calls that rose and fell as if measured. The sound grew heavier, punctuated by rumbles that shook dust loose overhead. Then the light at the entrance narrowed, blocked by bulk sliding into place, piece by piece until darkness closed entirely. They did not need to step near to know the scale. A boulder, the size of a small car, had been positioned across the opening. No beast without strength equal to machinery could have moved it. Here, that strength worked with patience, not chance. With the entrance sealed, the cave turned against them quickly. Rifles had no target. Food was miserably light. A few jerky strips, some dried oats, water in canteens already less than half full. They rationed automatically, though it offered no assurance. By the second night, walls pressed in with stink, sweat, and waste clouding the chamber until breathing grew foul. The brute muttered curses in the dark, but fatigue buried his voice soon after. The ex-soldier kept what order he could, setting rules for water sips, urging rest, his control thinning but visible. The oldest trembled visibly, hands shaking as if he could no longer hold weight, his voice reduced to dry rasp when thirst cut into him. Hours blurred without sun, time marked only by their bodies. By the fourth day, their speech degraded into moans and clipped arguments. Water nearly gone, throats cracked, and their thoughts closed around despair more than anger. The sound outside reminded them nothing had been forgotten. Grinding had ceased, replaced by occasional thuds, then silence again, like guardians shifting position more than leaving. Once a rumble pressed through stone so deep it felt ceremonial, a deliberate reminder that they remained contained where their captors wanted. Claustrophobia eroded judgment. In the dark, their nerves frayed. Whispers turned sharp. Suspicion flickered, but the weight of thirst muted even violence. At last, a sound broke the still routine, the scrape of shifting weight from outside. This time, smoother, measured. Stone strained again, the massive boulder dragging slowly aside, enough for daylight to leak through in a sliver. Dust shimmered in the beam, air rushing inward like relief itself. With desperation sharpened by starvation, they forced the gap wider. Each man clawed toward the opening, squeezing through narrow stone until lungs filled with open air. The world outside felt wrong in its quietness. Just beyond the tree line, not 50 yards away, stood figures. Motionless, tall, and broad, as still as carved pillars. One held the center, shoulders drawn wide, frame heavy, yet its stance calm. Its eyes fixed on them directly, studying with patience. The stare carried no wild frenzy, but an observing weight, disturbingly human in its focus. From it came a sound, low, grounded, guttural. Not a cry of triumph, but something quieter, a signal that needed no translation. To the men, it landed as judgment. No strike followed, no rush of bodies from the trees. Only presence, deliberate and unchallenged. Weapons never rose, for raising them felt meaningless. In that moment, the reality pressed sharper than the hunger of the cave. Their lives hung not on bullets, but on permission. One man would admit later fear drove him to abandon the others rather than gamble on any mercy lasting. That choice, steeped in shame, cut sharper than thirst, and it remained long after the forest let him go. What they faced beyond those stones was not slaughter, but something the woods had chosen to reveal. Force bound with restraint, territory defended with order, and in that restraint lay the weight of survival itself, waiting for the meaning to settle. The hunters entered the forest intent on killing, yet survival hinged on a choice made by something other than them. The beings held the power to end every man, but instead, one was permitted to walk away and remember. The survivor later reflected, "I know that sometimes, if we're very lucky, the things we don't understand will show us more mercy than we showed them." The woods did not shelter mindless predators, but guarded a community capable of judgment and restraint. If this unsettled you, tell us below. Would you take that job for $5,000? The man who escaped never returned to hunting. He sold his rifles, left the wilderness, and moved permanently to the city.